They said cutting Israeli deals in Africa was suicide. The lobbyists warned me. The businessmen threatened me. Even my own advisors whispered that I was gambling with my life. But 3 minutes ago, I signed the decree. Every Israeli deal in Burkina Faso is blocked, not postponed, not renegotiated, blocked. And Netanyahu, he's stunned. His embassy sent urgent cables. His ministers demanded clarification. His companies called in favors they've been stockpiling for years. I answered them all with one sentence. Africa is not for sale. Do you know why this moment matters? Because for decades, Israeli corporations weren't just signing contracts here. They were embedding themselves into the veins of our continent. Mining concessions disguised as partnerships, telecom networks that doubled as surveillance grids, agricultural projects that stripped farmers of their land while promising development. They thought we were blind. They thought we were too desperate to care. But we saw everything. Last month, my intelligence service handed me a dossier thicker than a Bible. Inside were blueprints of Israeli-backed infrastructure projects, roads that led directly into mineral-rich zones, satellite dishes wired into foreign intelligence hubs, contracts signed by leaders who never told their people the price of those signatures. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office staring at those papers until the desert wind rattled my windows and the first call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou. And I asked myself a question every African leader must eventually answer. Who do you serve? Your people or the powers who fund you? Because let me tell you what I saw in those pages. I saw maps marked with tiny red circles, each one a gold mine, a lithium deposit, a uranium field. But the roads didn't lead to African markets. They led to foreign ports, to Tel Aviv, to Paris, to Washington. I saw telecom towers dressed in corporate logos, standing like steel sentinels across our landscape. But behind their clean branding were systems that fed our citizens' voices into foreign servers. Every call, every text, every private word of an African family, packaged and sold like a commodity on markets we would never see. I saw irrigation projects sprawling across satellite images, fields that should have fed our children. Instead, they were fenced off, guarded by men with foreign accents, and harvested for export. The farmers who once tilled that land became day laborers, working their own soil for wages too small to buy bread. And here's the part that chilled me to the bone. These weren't isolated cases. It wasn't one deal, or 10 deals, or even 50. It was a network, a spiderweb stretching across 17 African nations, every thread leading back to the same hands. They thought Africa would never piece it together. They underestimated us. They always do. But I did piece it together, and once I saw the full picture, I knew there was no going back to the comfortable lies of partnership and development. The more I studied those documents, the clearer the pattern became. Every Israeli project followed the same blueprint. Enter through humanitarian channels, establish infrastructure under the guise of aid, then slowly transform that infrastructure into an intelligence-gathering apparatus. In Ghana, they built communication towers for rural connectivity. Within 2 years, those towers were routing every phone call through servers in Tel Aviv. In Kenya, they installed agricultural monitoring systems to help farmers optimize crop yields. Those systems were actually tracking population movements and mapping resource locations with military precision. In Mali, they established tech training centers for young Africans. The real purpose was to identify and recruit local intelligence assets while mining data from every device that passed through their networks. The pattern was so consistent, so methodical, it could only be the result of centralized planning. This wasn't random corporate opportunism. This was systematic intelligence colonization orchestrated at the highest levels of the Israeli government. But what truly shocked me was the cooperation from Western allies. French companies provided the legal frameworks. British firms handled the financial structures. American corporations offered technological support. They were all feeding from the same trough, dividing Africa's digital sovereignty among themselves like colonial powers carving up maps. The pressure came fast and from every direction. First, the lobbyists arrived at my doorstep. Men in expensive suits with teeth too white and smiles too practiced. They promised consequences if I interfered with established partnerships. They spoke of economic isolation, diplomatic difficulties, and mysterious accidents that befell leaders who didn't cooperate. Then came the businessmen offering contracts worth billions, shares in multinational corporations, and Swiss bank accounts that would make my children wealthy for generations. When I refused to even hear their proposals, proposals. Their tone shifted from seductive to menacing. "President," one of them said, leaning across my desk with cold eyes, "you're playing a game you don't understand. The rules were written long before you were born, and when those tactics failed, the threats began in earnest. Whispers of coups spread through international diplomatic circles. Rumors of assassination plots appeared in intelligence briefings from friendly nations. Even some of my own advisors, men I had trusted with my life, pulled me aside with trembling voices. "President, slow down. Don't provoke them. You've seen what happens to African leaders who challenge these forces. Gaddafi is dead. Sankara is dead. No one fights Israel and survives." But I remembered something they had all forgotten. Something that steel, money, and threats could never touch. I wasn't raised in palaces or educated in foreign universities. I didn't grow up at banquets where African resources were discussed like stock options. I grew up watching my mother count coins for bread, her weathered hands trembling as she tried to stretch our family's meager income. I grew up seeing my father's hands crack and bleed from labor in gold mines while foreign trucks rolled past our village carrying away wealth he would never touch. So when they told me this fight was impossible, I asked myself, impossible for who? For the men who profit from our silence, or for the people who have nothing left to lose? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief, Colonel Sawado, walked into my office carrying a folder that would change everything. His face was grave, his usual military composure shaken. Inside that folder were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite imagery that revealed the full scope of what we were facing. "Mr. President," he said, placing the documents before me, "what we've discovered goes beyond anything we imagined. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecommunications, tracking the movement of our citizens through facial recognition systems we never agreed to install. But here's what made me realize we were past the point of diplomacy. They were sharing this intelligence with multinational corporations to help them extract better deals from African governments. Our own data was being weaponized against us, used to exploit us more efficiently. I spent that entire night in my office. The dossier spread across my desk like evidence at a crime scene. The papers looked ordinary. Typed contracts, maps, spreadsheets. But to me, they felt like chains. Chains wrapped around my people's necks. Chains disguised as development and partnership. Outside my window, Ouagadougou slept peacefully, unaware that their every digital footprint was being harvested and sold. Children dreaming in beds their parents could barely afford, while foreign servers stored their biometric data for future exploitation. At 5 a.m., as the first hints of dawn painted the sky, I made my decision. I picked up the secure phone and called my generals. "Wake them up," I said, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to unleash. "Today we cut the web." General Cabra asked for operational details. I gave him only 2 words that would define the next phase of our nation's history: no mercy. 2 hours later, while most of Ouagadougou was still lost in sleep, our forces moved with the precision of a surgeon's blade. 17 targets identified through months of surveillance hit simultaneously. No warnings, no negotiations, no room for evidence to disappear. By 7 a.m., the spider web that had taken decades to weave was tearing apart. The first site was a gleaming telecommunications building on the eastern edge of town. From the street, it looked like any other modern office. Corporate logos, tinted glass, employees arriving for another day of routine business. But my soldiers found something that would make international headlines, though most media outlets would refuse to report the full story. Inside, we discovered server rooms filled with equipment powerful enough to monitor communications across half the continent. Rows of humming machines, each one a digital parasite feeding on African conversations. Hard drives containing personal data of over 2 million Burkina-Faso citizens. Their locations, their relationships, their private communications, all catalogued and prepared for transmission to foreign intelligence services. At the second location, we found something even worse. A warehouse district facility that appeared to be a humanitarian storage center. The signs outside promised emergency relief supplies and agricultural development resources. But instead of medicine and food, the warehouses contained surveillance drones. Hundreds of them, each coded to track movement across rural areas. These weren't commercial photography drones. These were military-grade surveillance platforms designed to monitor farmers and villagers who had no idea they were living under electronic observation. The operation manual we found was written in Hebrew, with targeting coordinates that matched perfectly with our major agricultural regions and mineral sites. By 9:20 a.m., 6 more sites had fallen to our coordinated assault. Each location revealed the same sinister pattern: legitimate business facades concealing sophisticated espionage operations, development projects that developed nothing except foreign intelligence capabilities, aid organizations that aided only their master's surveillance networks. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and for the first time in years, Africa had proof of what many of us had long suspected. But I knew that proof alone wouldn't be enough. Documents could be buried, explanations could be manufactured, and the global media machine could spin our discoveries into misunderstandings or overreactions. The world needed to see action, not just accusations. At noon, I walked into the press conference room where cameras from across the continent waited. The lights